Okay, welcome to part 4. So you've learned a lot. You've learned about fonts and colors and backgrounds and margins and padding. We're going to learn about something a little more complicated, a little more confusing. It seems to trick a lot of people up, and it's called floats and positioning. So I've created I've just modified our index.html file. We still have our div with an ID of container. You'll learn to use that a lot for your websites. And now I'm beginning to simulate an actual website markup. Maybe we have no header, maybe we just have a div with an ID of sidebar, some generic text, and then after it I have div with an ID of main. And the idea is in our heads we want this sidebar to be on the left side, and then we want the main content on the right side, like you would see normally on a website. The sidebar with navigation or something like that, the sub-navigation is on the left, it's very thin, and then the rest of the website is your main content. Okay? How can we do that? It's floating. We would say we'll float the sidebar to the left and maybe float something else to the right, something like that. So let's save this, let's go back into Firefox, refresh the page, and this is what we get. Okay, so we're going to do some base styling first, just so we understand what we're working with. So when people want to figure out kind of the parameters of their elements, a lot of people will set a border, 1 pixel solid, any black, just to get an idea. I recommend that you don't do this because borders add to the width and they can break layouts. As you're going to learn, floated layouts are very, very sensitive. So don't use borders, don't do anything that will affect the width of something. Instead, use a background. Nothing wrong with setting a background of this color. You can remove it later when you're done. And we're going to do the same thing for our main section. Remember, again with semantics, we're not saying right content or left content. We're saying this is a sidebar. This is the main area. Always remember that. And we're going to set a background of just a darker color. That's fine. That'll do. So we're going to turn this into the beginnings of a website. I want this sidebar to only be about this wide, and I want this main content to jump up to the right side, like a website, right? Float. So we're going to say sidebar, float, left. But when I do this, you're not going to see anything just yet. Float left. Okay, why didn't that work? And it's because it's still bound to its container, or in this case, the div with an ID of container. As you can see right there. I'm sorry, right there. Still wants to take up all the space, so we need to specify how wide it is. We can specify that with, as I said, pixels, as we learned in the last lesson, ems, or a percentage. So I could set a width 25%, and you can immediately see that pushes over. 25% is not of the browser window. It's 25% of its parent container, parent element's width. So in this case, it's saying find the width of div with an ID of container, and then set the sidebar's width to 1/4 of that. All right. So we can specify this even more. So if we want to say container, and that parent element's width should be 500 pixels. Now it's different, and it's because 25% of 500 pixels is very different from the default, which would be the entire width of the screen. As you can see, if I make this bigger, the sidebar actually gets larger. Okay. Pretty cool. So in this case, we are going to set the width to 250 pixels, something like that. And now, because we floated it to the left, it allows main content to jump up. Okay. So if I want, I can get rid of that, and you'll see the difference. We set a width here, but it's still, because these are block level elements, and that's something I'd like to get into shortly, they will take up as much space and be on their own line, so to speak. So let's go ahead and add float left back in. Okay, so now, assuming we're sticking with these background colors, we can maybe add some margin right to the sidebar, margin right of 20 pixels. Okay, and you can see what it does right there. It pushes it away a little bit. What if we did padding right? And that way, we actually still see the background when you do padding. So if I set padding to 100, you're going to see a lot of that light gray background. But if you set margin, it's pushing it over. Okay, so let's save that. And why don't we go ahead and get rid of these background colors now that we know what we're working with. Okay, so we have one more thing though. Is if you notice, if we set miscellaneous ruler, why are these not lining up correctly? Did you ever wonder about that? So let's go ahead and I'm going to Command Z, and this will go back and add these background colors back in. And let's go back into our TextMate, and we can see both of them div with an ID of sidebar, H2, div with an ID of main, H2. And this is where things can become kind of confusing. Again, the reason this is happening is because of what the browser is adding by default. So you can see an H2 tag by default has some margin on the top. So if we want to make sure that just all H2 tags have no top margin, we can say H2 margin top 0. And that'll push that up and get rid of any default styling. Okay? So let's go ahead and get rid of the ruler. So now let's say we want to add some spacing around the text. Remember the breathing room? So as I said before, we could set padding all around of 10 pixels, but that's going to increase the width of that element. So we would either need to reduce the width accordingly or apply the padding to only its children. So if I wanted, I could do sidebar P, sidebar H2. And the solution is going to be different for every project. Sometimes it might be easier to lower the width and add the padding. Other times it might be easier just to go ahead and be direct and do padding. And here we can set the padding as high as we want, and it will never affect the width of our main element. Okay? 10 pixels all around is fine. Or we could set anything. We could create a class for each of these, and that way we know that each class we can apply some padding. You can be as creative as you want in this case. So if we want to be very, very specific, we could do main P. Let me go back. Let's see what we have here. Yeah, main P. And that's padding. We could change that to 30 pixels if we want. So we can do a lot of things. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that thing entirely. And I want to show you how to work more in the confines of an actual website. So let's say that a common width for websites these days is 960 pixels. So we can set the parent element to have a width of 960 pixels. Okay? And now if we zoom out, you can see that that width is bound. These elements, because we haven't really set specific values, will modify themselves. But we still have one problem. And you know what I'm going to do here, because we're on a low resolution? Let's assume that, at least what I'm recording on, let's assume that the width is much smaller, 600 pixels. You see it's how all the way pushed to the left? Is there a way that we can specify, no, we want our website to be centered on the page no matter how large it is? Yes. And the way you do that is set margins. So we've learned how to set like specific values, but if we set them to auto, what this is saying is, actually it's saying all around, but we're going to say for this example, the margin on the left and right should be automatically set, and they should be equal. Now when you set equal, there's only one way to make sure that the margin left is equal to what the margin right is, and that's if it's centered on the page. And as you can see here, the width of this space right here is identical to the width here, and now we have a centered website. So if we come back here and let's say we want to set a header, if we're working in HTML5, we can use the header element, but we'll keep it simple here and do div, give it an ID of header, and my header, and then maybe, I don't know, my slogan goes here. Save that, refresh the page, and now we have our header, we have our slogan. If we want to target the header specifically, again, we can do header, background, green. And already you can see we have the beginnings of a website. So most websites are divided into certain components. You have your header, you have maybe sidebar. If we're going with HTML5, we use a side. Don't worry about that yet. You're probably not to that point yet, and that's okay. We have our main content, and then maybe we'd have, just at the bottom, a footer. With HTML5, you'd use the footer element. Footer, and here, this can be copyrights, this can be links. I'm just going to add my footer here. Save that, refresh the page, and now we can go back and say footer. And remember, we're again just setting random colors right now. Set it to black. So if I set it to black, you're not going to be able to see the text. And remember, it's because the default text color by the browser is always going to be black. So if we set the background to black, we need to make sure that we set the color to something that we can see. Just to be completely random. Okay, so this presents an interesting thing here with floats. Notice how the footer, why does the footer look like it's under main content? It's not. If we come back, I mean, technically it is, but it's under sidebar as well. So why is sidebar almost going below the footer? And it's because of floats. So floats are a hard thing to get your head around. When you float something, it's common to say that you take it out of the flow of the document. That's not 100% true. But for at least getting your head around it, think of it that way. So if you float something, everything else jumps up. Okay? And the same is true for positioning. So if I were to go to sidebar and set float and remove that, the footer is going to go back to the bottom. Okay? So if we apply float left, we push it all the way to the left, and now anything else can jump up. As you see, the main content jumped up. But the only problem is my footer, the footer also jumped up as well because our sidebar is pretty tall. So we need a way to tell the footer, no, you need to make sure that you clear any floated elements above it so we don't get this weird issue here. This confused me a lot. Even describing it to you, I can imagine how it's confusing. But we want to say here, let's make sure the footer clears any floated elements above it. So we can use, thankfully, a clear property. And this wants to know, do you clear the left float? Do you clear the right float? Do you want to clear both? Let's just set both. We technically could get away with left. But I'm going to set both out of habit. And now it's going to clear any floats that are above it. Okay? So we have a couple more things. You notice, why is there no spacing between the colors here, but there's spacing right up here? And it's because, remember, it all comes back to that browser default styling. It adds some margins to these H2 tags by default. So if we want, we have margin 2 set to 0, but it also sets margins to paragraph tags. So if I were to go to P, and don't do this in your project, but if I set margin bottom to 0, that's going to push up. Because all paragraphs inherently have some margin, and as they should. If you have multiple paragraphs, as you can see right here, I can't remember if that's multiple or not. Nope, it's not. It's one paragraph. But if you had multiple and you set the margin bottom to 0, it would look like one huge paragraph and there would be no spacing. So what you could always do in this case is be a little more specific. And you could say header P, or maybe you could come back to your TextMate and set an ID of slogan. You could do whatever you want depending on how flexible you want to be. Set header P, margin bottom to 0, and that'll push that up. So as you can see here, we already have a working website. It doesn't look very good, but you can see with CSS how powerful it is we can easily modify this as much as we want. If we come back and we decide, you know what, let's make this container much bigger, 900 pixels, it automatically modifies itself. CSS is extremely powerful. But you already knew that. That's why you're learning it. So we have a couple other things. I don't know if I want to get into column heights. You can see right here, notice how the background here stops. Shouldn't it extend all the way to the footer? And the answer is actually no. This float goes all the way to the bottom. This main content here, the background is going to take up as much space as it needs. So you see the text ends, it's not going to take up any more space. So this is actually a point of confusion for a lot of people, and there are a couple remedies. One of them is to use table type CSS styling. I don't want to get into that. That's too high for this area. But another one is to use background images. So we'll do that right now. And what we'll do here is, what can we do? Let's copy this like so, just so I can be lazy. And we're going to go into Photoshop, and we're going to save this as a background image. Let's give this just a moment to load up. New file. And all we did was we sliced out just that background. So we have one side is the lighter and one side is the darker. I'm going to save for web and devices and save it as a ping. That's fine. We're not going to worry about this too much. CSS, and we could create a new folder called images, and we're going to save this as bg.png. So now if I go back to TextMate, we have, if I open up the drawer, we have a new images folder, and we can use this now. So we can go to container, and now rather than setting background color of orange, and notice how we could do that right there. So if we wanted to be really lazy and we thought we could get away with it, we could actually set the background to this color, and it would seemingly work, but not really, and I'll show you why. If we come back to TextMate and if we make the main content larger than the sidebar is, save, refresh the page, now you can see where the problem is, and we'd have a whole new issue. So that's not the solution. But what is the solution is setting background images. So background, and we'll explain this later. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this, and then we'll come back. Save. Lots of cover, isn't it? It's a lot to, don't worry if you're getting confused. Feel free to go back and watch these videos as much as you want. Okay, so let's go back and set the background, and we're going to reference that image now. And the way we reference an image is by doing URL, and it wants to know a path to that image. If we go to Text Expander, it wants to know the path from the style sheet file. So we're in CSS, so we know that from this file, we need to go up into the images folder. So we can go up by doing /, then images folder, and I actually call that images, and then the file name, which is bg.png. Okay, lastly, it wants to know, should it repeat? By default, background images repeat. So if you had like maybe a little texture as the background, it would by default repeat, or you could clarify and say repeat. Okay. Now, what we could do is set no repeat. No repeat, and that means if maybe you have one background image for maybe the entire website, you could say, I don't want it to repeat just a single time. You could be more specific and set repeat X along the X-axis or repeat Y along the Y-axis. So we'll keep it at repeat. And what I need to do here, actually the way the web developer toolbar is I need to set that background a little bit differently. It's kind of confusing. Don't worry about it too much. It's just because when you're editing CSS, the paths change a little bit. So if I bring that back in, come back, I hope I'm not rambling, and I refresh the page, that is going to work. But as soon as I edit CSS, that'll be removed, and it's because suddenly we're working from the position of the index file rather than where the style sheet was. So we would need to remove that. Okay, so and this is how we do it. Now it looks like I accidentally got the wrong background color. So we would want to modify our image. But this is still very helpful because no matter how high our sidebar gets, we will have a background. So this is one way of accomplishing that task. So let's go back and tackle that issue with the multiple paragraphs on the main section. Okay? You see how it's already coming over, and this is correct. This is the same thing. We could float an image to the left, and this same thing would happen, and it's really what you want. It allows for wrapping. So if sidebar, in your imagination, was an image, the text would wrap around the image, and then as soon as the image cut off, the text would take up as much space again. So this isn't really what we want. So the way we can fix it, actually, is to set a margin left of we set a margin left of the main content equal to the width of the sidebar. That is one way that we could do it. So let's come back and let's go to main content right here. And I can set a margin left equal to, and if I set width of 250 pixels, I can say set a margin left of 250 pixels. And now it'll be pushed over that entire amount. Now another solution is to also float the main content. So right here you see that we're floating the sidebar, and so the rest of the content is going to wrap around it. But what if we were to take the main and we said, you know what, we floated the sidebar to the left, why don't we float the main content to the right? Okay, so it pushes down. That doesn't make sense. If we floated it to the right, why did it bounce down? And it's because now it's not wrapping, it wants to take up all of that space again. So we have to set a width to the main content. How much? Okay, we know the entire width of our container is 600 pixels. We know that our sidebar is 250 pixels. So you would think, okay, let's set the width to 350 pixels. And ta-da, it jumps up. Now, remember when I said floats are really tricky? What happens if we set it even 5 or 10 pixels more? It's going to jump all the way down. Okay, So if we set 355, it's going to do it. 354 does it. 353, 352. It's going to do it all because then 352 plus 250 becomes more than the width of the container, so they can't physically be floated. They have to jump down to a new line in order to accommodate the width that you've set. So you can imagine here, okay, we have 350. What if we want more spacing between this text and this text? If we set margin right 20 pixels, it jumps down again. So why? The width is still correct, but now we've applied a margin to it. So we would need to bring the width down accordingly. And now it doesn't look great, as I said, but we now have a floated element. So let's go ahead and get rid of the margins, and let's bring the width back to 350. And of course, to clarify, in these cases where, before we head off, where we have a background image, we don't need to apply the backgrounds again. So we could go to the main and get rid of that, go there and get rid of that, and now we would have our solid colors. So you wouldn't set background colors and then override them again. You would just let that one tile. And remember how I said you could do repeat by default? If I set no repeat, you'll see that you don't see anything. If I set repeat X, you won't see anything. Because in this case, we want that little tiny graphic to repeat Y vertically. So we did repeat Y, it'll work. And if we do repeat, it'll do both by default. And that's how you would do it. And then beyond this, we'll set paddings and do some more fun stuff. And the final step is to give that padding. Why don't we do for example, why don't we do the option of setting the width a little bit smaller? So we'll set the width, in this case, to 230 and apply 10 pixels of padding all around. Okay. If you want, you could do 20 pixels, but then you would need to lower that accordingly. All right. And then we could do the same thing for the main. And why don't we take this and pull it above the footer? And let's bring that down. 20 pixels. Okay. And then you could do the same thing, and you're going to notice some overlapping, right? So set padding, 20 pixels. Okay, and why don't we set, for padding, you see all that space up there, why don't we set the padding on the top to 0, 20 on the right, maybe 10 on the bottom, and 20 on the left. Okay, and I don't know, let's experiment just a little bit. Okay, that's fine for this case. And if we want, we can just set it all around maybe. But then you'll see that the lines over here aren't quite as nice. So if we set display ruler, notice how the lines don't look good anymore. So you want to make sure that everything lines up. Set 20 pixels. That looks much better. Those lines line up. And then if you want, you can set header, H1, get rid of that default margin top that the browser applies. Okay, miscellaneous display ruler, get rid of that. And now we have a nice, not necessarily nice, but a fully efficient and working website, and you just got started with CSS. So you have a lot to go on, a lot to work on over the course of the next week or so, and then I'll be back with the final 5, maybe 6 parts. So yeah, thanks for watching, and stay tuned.